Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about pricing, and that's going to include a little bit of review of some econ concepts. So the first of those is the downward sloping demand curve. So probably most of you guys have taken Econ 101 already, and you have encountered the downward sloping demand curve. The idea being here that as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, with price being on the Y, quantity demanded being on the X. All right, so why do we have a downward sloping demand curve? Well, there's a number of reasons, a number of factors that contributing to that. The first is the decreasing marginal utility. So if classic example is, imagine you're hungry and you go buy a hamburger at McDonald's, those little ones, and you're less hungry, so maybe you're not quite all the way full, so you buy another one. Each subsequent hamburger, you don't like it as much as the one that came before it. So we have, as we get more of something, we have less need for it, and we have decreasing marginal utility. So marginal utility being the value we get out of the next thing. We also have substitution effects driving the downward slope. So for example, as price goes up, we start to shift to other alternatives. So if the price of coffee goes up, maybe we buy tea, right? We also have an income effect that contributes to the downward slope. So as things become more expensive, I have less income, and therefore I purchase less of that thing. So all of these kind of factors, and there are more issues, but contribute to this demand curve that slopes downward. There are some fun exceptions. So one being Veblen goods, or what's called prestige products. For these, essentially, if we think of it as a jobs to be done kind of issue, the job that they're doing is being expensive. So the more expensive they get, they usually are status items, right? So the more expensive they get, the better they are at doing that job of conferring status. So in that case, we actually see a demand effect for these type of goods that actually slopes upward. The more you charge for them, the more people want to buy them, right? There's also a lesser known alternative called, or a place where the demand curve shifts in an upward sloping direction, and that is a Giffen good. So a Giffen good is so an example might have been a potato during the Irish potato famine. So during the Irish potato famine, there was a blight on the potato crop. People who are potato farmers became exponentially poorer. Price of potatoes went up, but they actually bought more of them because a potato was the cheapest staple food crop. So because you have this product, even though the price of it is going up, because it's the cheapest thing and version of that thing, it actually goes up. So these are kind of interesting sort of theoretical exceptions. The one that's more applicable to marketing is probably the prestige good, but most of the time we're dealing with a downward sloping demand curve. Now with that downward slope, we want to think about how fast or slow it is sloping. So if we have something that is a very steep slope, we might refer to that as inelastic demand. So what that means is for a big change in price, we'll see a much smaller change in quantity. So a classic example of this might be drugs, so insulin, for example. So someone who has diabetes who relies on insulin shots for survival, if you increase the price of insulin, they're not going to decrease their consumption of insulin very much, if at all. So this is a place where companies can sort of take advantage of consumers because they don't have the ability to adjust their consumption based on price changes. On the opposite end of that spectrum, we have very flat, or demand curves that are getting much more flat and more elastic. So elastic demand curve is one where a very small change in price results in a large change in quantity purchase, up to the point where we have technically what's referred to as a perfectly elastic demand curve. Might be something in the case of a commodity. So a commodity product might be something like corn or soybeans or frozen orange juice concentrate, and the price of that is determined by the market. And if I take my soybeans to the place where, farmers take their soybeans to be weighed and purchased, you can't say like, the price is this much per bushel. I would like more than that, because they're Bob's soybeans, and they were like, no, we don't do that here. We just buy soybeans. It's a commodity. Whatever the price is that day, that's the price you get. And so if you try to sell it for even a penny more than that, no one will buy it. And there's no reason to sell for any less than that, because people will buy everything that you have at the market price. So that is sort of the example of a pure commodity that would have a perfectly flat demand curve. There are lots of factors that impact the slope of the demand curve. So whether or not something has a viable substitute, whether or not we use price to infer quality, whether there's a switching cost involved. So maybe if Apple raises the price of its next phone to $2,000, a lot of people might not switch to an Android because they have all of their services tied up in the Apple ecosystem. So the switching costs would be like very time intensive. So all these, number of factors you can read through there, but contribute to how much that demand curve is steep versus flat. Now, for marketers, we vastly prefer a steeper demand curve as opposed to a flat one. In fact, the sort of great fear of brand marketers is becoming a commodity. So when products become a commodity is when they start sort of competing on features, which sort of usually they compete on technical features, which ultimately leads to them competing on price. So Dell computers back in the 90s kind of trained everyone, because in those days people used to like build their own computers by picking out how big the hard drive is and how much RAM and what the screen resolution was and what chip it was. The problem is, and that was a really cool innovation for Dell, that they were able to have really flexible manufacturing to produce these things. You could pick all of these components and they would send it out to you. The problem is that they trained people to think about computers in terms of hard drive space and RAM megabytes and pixels on the screen and whatever chip it had, which then once other companies like HP and some others came along and said, well, we can do all that and maybe offer you at a slightly better price, then people are like, oh, well, I don't care about the product so much. I only care about these functional benefits. Yeti cooler, to use the Yeti example, has sort of took the same approach. All right, so Yeti says you can stand on the cooler. The cooler can keep ice for 5 days. Without melting. The cooler will keep, it's lockable and secure, and you can keep you safe from bears. And you saw and the thing about that is, at the time, they were the only company that could make those claims. But pretty soon, other companies started copying them and having coolers you could stand on that would keep ice for, for 5 days and all this. And it wasn't entirely clear what the benefit of Yeti coolers was. So I remember at the time, you would see like people like on YouTube playing like scientists and like getting a Yeti cooler and an Arctic cooler and an Orca cooler and a whatever cooler, and then they would fill them up. They would try to fill them up with the same amount of ice, and then they would like go in there with a laser thermometer and measure how much ice they had and do these little experiments, because in essence, Yeti was competing on this idea that we keep ice from melting the longest. Well, that's a functional sort of benefit. It's not built really around a brand, so to speak. So other companies then can if that's the benefit you're offering me, or you're offering, I can do that as well, and it becomes not as clear why I should buy one product versus another. More of a historical example, when Coca-Cola first sort of came on the market with this new thing called the Cola, Pepsi Cola came in right behind it and said, we're also this thing called the Cola, but our serving size is twice as big, so it's effectively half the cost. So this was essentially, again, they were trying to commoditize the idea of what it meant to be a cola and compete on price, right? Which is why you see brands kind of moving away from this direction. So if you look at Yeti, they've done, invested quite a bit in, these films, lifestyle branding, right? And Yeti is, really competing more on prestige products and drinkware and sort of offering a higher quality price point on some of their other things, moved away from talking about the sort of ice retention abilities of their coolers. That's not what their message is anymore. Their message is about something else, because that is not a sustainable way of maintaining a brand. If you're gonna compete on these sort of functional benefits, then you start to evolve into a commodity. Right? Similar, we have some famous examples of Mac versus PC. So Apple doesn't really talk about their like processing speeds and hard drive capacities and this stuff. They're like, if you're a cool kind of hip person, you use a Mac. If you're kind of a dowdy old professor type, then you use a PC, right? The Cola Wars, where Pepsi was pitting itself against Coca-Cola. Pepsi was for the new generation and young hip people in a similar kind of way, and Coke was for old people. So, this idea is that the way to create a defensible brand is not really to market on these sort of features, but more around these sort of lifestyle kind of things. All right. So this is, in line with some of the stuff that we've seen before of our, talking about an evolution to an experience economy, right? So in sort of historical, economies are underdeveloped. We're dealing in sort of commodities, right? We're extracting commodities from the earth, and we're like getting them to market where people can buy them. As we develop a little bit more, we're starting to make goods. After, the next evolution is we're starting to sort of, transition into a service economy where the bulk of our GDP is being provided by services around those manufactured products. Then we sort of get into the stage where we're, creating these experiences for people. So this is the idea of the experience economy that we're kind of in now. And then ultimately, maybe some point help marketers are guiding people into transforming and sort of self-actualizing, right? So this would be consistent with the Christensen perspective of jobs to be done, where all products or many products are helping us make progress towards some sort of goal related to our self-identity. And this is the sort of evolution. And so this is in the space where marketers ideally want to operate, is in the sort of services, experiences, sort of CX, and then this jobs to be done kind of space. All right. So let's switch into kind of how we go about pricing, because ideally we don't want to be a commodity. We want to be somebody who can charge something other than the market price for our products. So how do we go about selecting what price to assign to a particular product? Well, there's a idea called the pricing tripod, or sometimes the pricing stool, which you'll see in various places. This one is from a services marketing textbook, but first is like cost. So it costs some money to make the product, so you have to price your product at a level that's at least going to cover your cost, and at least your marginal cost, and put some make some money towards your fixed costs so that you can stay in business, right? So if you're not charging at least that amount, you're not going to stay in business very long. So there is this sort of tradition in the especially during the .com days, and even until a few years ago, that tech companies didn't really worry about making money so much, right? They were only worried about building huge user bases, with the idea that if we just get enough users together, somehow we can extract money from them at some point. That's a very tenuous sort of business model. And, more recently, it's starting to fall out of favor with venture capitalists and other investors, that this idea at some point we really would like to see people pricing out a service that in a way that makes money. Right? So rather than just getting a bunch of eyeballs or users with the idea that we'll figure that out later. All right, next up, we have value to customers. So value to customers is we're trying to figure out what people are willing to pay for something. So this is the most you can charge. So whereas the costs might be considered the price floor, the most you can charge is this sort of value to customers, what they would be willing to pay. And so within that range, you might then think about where competition is and how your pricing positions you compared to the competition. So because price is one of the big 4 Ps in our marketing mix, it's going to be part of those tools that we use to position ourselves against competitors. So I do have value to customers highlighted there because I think that's often not is overlooked more than it should. We really need to be thinking about our products and services and experiences and in terms of the value that they provide to customers and what they would be willing to pay for them. The book has kind of a slightly different framework. It does include cost and the sort of idea of cost and the value people would be willing to pay and competition, but it also has a few other things. So compatibility would be essentially the sort of a positioning argument. So is our price consistent with our overall positioning strategy? Do we have sort of a thing that's looks like a luxury product on all sort of other dimensions that's very sort of strangely low priced, or vice versa, right? The other one be channels of distribution. So as we transition into talking about channels, one of the key things we're going to think about is profitability to all the intermediaries in that channel. So you have to consider not just the consumer and the end consumer and your own costs, but you have to also consider, do you have enough pricing built into that in order to make it worthwhile to the distributors and the retailers and the agents and all that kind of thing. All right. So just a couple more, a little bit of pricing terminology to kind of remind you of. So we have total fixed costs. So this might be the sort of, cost of equipment or something that would take to manufacture a product, cost that can't be changed. A variable cost is the amount of money it would cost to, produce those units. So, and then we go through and we have some average variable costs and average fixed costs. Marginal cost is the one I would like to highlight. Marginal cost is the cost of the next unit. So theoretically, in econ, you should always be, as you could drop your price theoretically again to a point that is where you're at least covering marginal cost. So the additional cost of producing the next item, then you can drop your price all the way to that. Once you drop your price below marginal cost, you're losing money. Anything above marginal cost, you're contributing somewhat to your fixed costs. All right. So something to think about when setting a price is what are we managing towards? So we always want to be sort of very mindful and think about our KPIs and what we're managing towards when we're setting a price. So they can be, several categories. We can think about revenue and profits. We can think about also, patronage and user-centered objectives. So this is like that .com kind of model where maybe we want to price a little lower than would be ideal from a profit perspective, but it allows us to build a bigger user base with the idea that maybe we can, extract money from that user base at some point in the future. It could also be sort of strategy related, things related to, again, how we're thinking about our competition and how we want to position against that competition. So the book breaks these down into some more specific ones, but I sort of have them grouped there in the previous slide. Here's some things we might want to think about. So we don't just exist in a vacuum when we're setting prices. So right now, something that's been in the news a lot is inflation and the fact that companies are jacking up the prices of their products while simultaneously reporting record profits to their investors, and they're getting a lot of bad press for this. And there's a lot of tension about inflation in the news media right now, and so. you may also want to think about how do we price our products in relation to this sort of larger environment. Moving on to pricing strategies. So I would say the number one strategy that I sort of like to think about is what you might call product line strategy. So I think I've mentioned kind of this before. In some way, this is kind of sums up marketing in some sense. So here what we see is a variety of different products. All of these are Procter & Gamble products, right? And why does Procter & Gamble have so many different lines and brands? It's essentially they're just taking something and tweaking the position of it, some of the features. Is it packaged in a big bottle of big sort of cheap bottle and positioned as a value thing? Is it in a little fancy glass thing and positioned as sort of more exotic or luxurious or whatever? Is it targeted towards men who haven't been trained to care about something very much? Is it targeted towards women? Is it targeted towards people who care about the environment, who are more conscious of products with fewer ingredients? Like all of these things they can use to try to essentially create different versions of the same basic product, but for different types of people who are willing to pay different prices. So this is the idea behind product line pricing. Maybe even a cleaner example is like laundry detergent. All right, so you have Tide and Cheer and Gain and Tide with Arm & Hammer and I don't even know, and the whole aisle, and most of these are owned by the same company, right? So they're just taking laundry detergent and just tweaking this and that and this and that in order to sort of carve the market into all these little segments that they can capture. And so this falls under the heading of product line pricing when it is a company that is essentially creating a product line that appeal to different price points. Another more straightforward example that doesn't necessarily require multiple brands might be something like an iPhone Pro, an iPhone A and S, and this kind of ones with a little bit smaller screen and one's a little bit bigger screen and one that's a little newer and one's a little older of the iPhone, all again so we can cover the entire spectrum of what people are willing to pay. So you see up in the corner there's an example of I just grabbed an old laser printer picture off the internet to remind me to tell you this story of when laser printers first came out. They were incredibly expensive and thousands of dollars, and there was a market in businesses that were willing to pay for the laser printer, but there was also a smaller market of maybe home users who couldn't just quite justify a couple $1,000s for a printer. So what this manufacturer did was they actually took their existing printer and they added a chip to it to make it very much slower. So they like detuned it, so to speak, made it put an extra thing in there to make it perform worse. And then they sold that modified version of the printer to the home market at sort of a lower price that made sense for that home market. So they actually took the product, made it just so they could sell it to this other market. They put more money in it to make it worse so they could sell it to this other market at a discounted price. And so that, they got in a little bit of trouble for that, but this is an example, I think, of one group of people may be able to want to see a lot of value in something, and another group of people may not see the same amount of value in something, but you could still sell to them profitably. So marketing is about okay, how do we sell to all these different groups of people the same basic thing without irritating any of them, by each sort of making it feel like they have their own unique experience. So on some level, I saw some video today or the other day about gold crusted, like gold. You take gold leaf and you cover it in the steak that you cook, and then you put salt on it like that, and now all of a sudden that steak is $1,000. It's not really any better. It's arguably worse in many cases than steak you would get for $100, and not much better than a steak you would, get for $25. But it's been gold leafed and has been had salt put on it, and now is Instagrammable. And so you take that sort of commodity almost product of a slab of beef, and you prepare it in different ways, and then it appeals to people who have different amounts of money to spend on steak related experiences. So essentially, at some level, that's kind of what marketing is all about. But anyway, moving on, there's some other strategies. Another one I wanted to draw your attention to was the idea of captive product pricing. So the kind of a great example of this, it would be again, printers, right? So for a while, I can remember at one point it cost more to buy the ink for a printer than it did to buy the printer. And so you would get a starter ink kit. At one point, I remember somebody I knew just instead of going out and buying ink, they would just buy a new printer and throw the other one away because it came with a full ink cartridge, and it was actually cheaper to buy the whole printer at the time than it was to buy the replacement ink cartridge. And so this is the idea behind captive product pricing. Canon or whoever was not making money on that first printer, but they were hoping that they would be able to sell you money for the life of the printer, or sell you ink for the life of the printer that would then make that money back. Right? Keurig is another example. So they probably lose money on the coffee machine in the early days, but then they make their money back selling you the pods. Right? Same idea between all these. We have a number of examples where, and this is true of services more generally as well. Oftentimes the original product can represent a loss for the company, but it's the ancillary services or ancillary products that go along with it that actually end up making the money. Right? All right. So thinking about value to customers. So, here we're thinking about, different pricing strategies. We always have to be mindful about, what the value is. So value is going to be something that is very subjective and probably best viewed through the lens of jobs to be done. All right. So here down at the bottom, we have two the similar style of watch. So there's kind of a military field watch. On the one on the left, I think is a Timex, and the one on the right is IWC, so International Watch Company, Top Gun edition. So that one on the right, the one on the left costs $60, $65. The one on the right's going to go for, I forget, it's $5,000 maybe, somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000. I forget exactly, right? But as you can see, they're sort of remarkably similar. I'm sure that the one on the left actually tells time better because it would be a quartz watch, and the one on the right would be a mechanical watch. So what is the job to be done there? It's not, it's not really telling time. Isn't probably not the job to be done, because that could be done better with the $65 watch. So it's probably something related to status, or showing like you have a collectible watch if you're a watch person, or something around authenticity. So this is also, when we talk about the evolution from commodities to experiences, one of the key sort of attributes that people think about in this space is how authentic an experience is. So you could also probably get at some point in the near future a fake of this IWC field watch. Where would that fit in the continuum, right? I don't know exactly, right? What job would that be doing? Would it be doing a different job than the authentic one? So a lot of things to think about in the sort of space of value to customers. A couple other last things I wanted to mention in terms of pricing is there's a strategy called a blue ocean strategy, or sort of a management philosophy, I guess you would say. And the idea behind a blue ocean strategy is that you would like to be in a blue ocean. And a blue ocean is a space where there are no other, boats competing with you, but you're just off on your own in this blue ocean all by yourself. A red ocean, on the other hand, is like where all these ships are fighting against each other, and the water is red from all the blood from all the fighting. Now, in marketing, this would be, or business, this fighting takes the form often of competing over price or price wars. So the thing about price wars is they're very dangerous for businesses to get into price war. The way this works is we're selling something we see as being in competition with each other as a sort of substitute. We decrease our price. If it's more of a flatter demand curve where we're seen as more of a commodity and we decrease our price, a lot of consumers will run over to us and we'll be happy. But then what's it very easy for a competitor to do? Just raise a little bit below our price, and then everybody runs back over to the competitor, and it gets in this back and forth. So ultimately prices are driven down to marginal costs. Whoever has the lowest, who's ever produced at the lowest price is the one that wins, and the other one goes out of business. Meanwhile, the other firm is left sort of competing at a very low profit levels. So this is a less ideal situation for businesses to find themselves in, which is why they're very, or should be very, reluctant to engage in price wars. All right. So there's a lot of different pricing strategies, that people can use. You see different ones. So freemium. The freemium idea is one you see in sort of apps a lot. So you have a free version of the app and then a premium version of the app. We have economy pricing, psychological pricing, which we talked about, dynamic pricing, which we'll talk about in a minute. But just kind of give you a flavor. There's a lot of different sort of pricing things out there. Some of them are a little more fringe. So there are a few companies that occasionally will pop up doing pay what you want. Usually this goes on for a while till enough people take advantage of it that it becomes a negative experience and they stop doing it. You see that every once in a while. Dynamic pricing is where you change the price frequently based on existing conditions. Promotional pricing, for example, might be like something like a loss leader. So a loss leader is a concept where you bring someone into the store by selling them something that you're going to lose money on. So you might see a really fantastic sale on like 2 liters of Coca-Cola for 99 cents. The store is not planning on, making money on those, but they're planning on, you coming into the store, getting the Coke, and then buying some other stuff that is, more high margin. Right? So this is not dissimilar from the idea of the captive product pricing idea, except that you're not really, it's more in a store shopping retail experience kind of setting. We also have some unethical pricing things. So we have price fixing or collusion. Anytime you have a few players in a market, there's the opportunity for them to instead of competing with each other, to collude and agree to drive up prices, sort of effectively acting like a monopoly. We have deceptive price advertising, so something like a bait and switch, where you promote a product as being very low cost, and then when people get in there, all the low cost one is sold out, but here's this higher cost one since you've driven all the way down here. Predatory pricing is kind of an interesting one. Predatory pricing, Walmart would be accused of a lot. Basically what this involves is going into a market and losing money, but you can sustain the losses more than the smaller competitors, so you drive them out of business by charging unsustainable prices, and then you raise the price back up, sometimes higher than the level that they were before you entered the market. So this is the idea of predatory pricing. So price discrimination is when a company charges different prices to different people based for essentially the same product, just depending on what they think that person would be willing to pay. So one of my friends worked in software sales for a while, and he said that his company would essentially go to a potential client, size them up, see kind of how much value they would get out of the software package, and then sort of charge them accordingly. And because essentially it doesn't cost that much more for them to implement another copy of the software they've already written, but different companies see different value in it, and so that's how they would try to price the product. So companies usually don't like it when they hear this, because nobody likes it when they think they're getting charged the same price for different things. So Amazon at one point in time played around with trying to charge different prices for the same product to different people based on what they'd be willing to pay, and that just didn't go over very well. So you'll have to be careful about that sort of thing, or else you run into perceived fairness issues. So another good one was kind of in the same space. Coca-Cola experimented with a technology that would change the price of vending machines depending on how hot it was. So as the temperature went up outside, all of a sudden the water and the soda would become more expensive, because presumably people in that situation are willing to pay more for it. So people really didn't like that, because they felt they were being sort of gouged and taken advantage of, right? Anytime you have this sort of something being charged more than you would typically think it should be charged, just because people really want it, people kind of get upset. So Taylor Swift's recent concert tour, you can't get into a ticket for under 5 figures, or maybe 4 figures anyway. It's just, and so that rubs people sort of the wrong way. Even if it's they'd be willing to pay it, it seems kind of unjust in some way. All right. So moving on to services pricing. So services have their own special concerns when it comes to pricing. So one of the key issues with services is the issue of perishability. So perishability is the idea that if I don't sell a hotel room one night, if it stays empty, then I can't send someone back in time to stay in that hotel room. If a plane takes off and nobody's in the seat, I can't sell that seat. So this is because of this, pricing services are what's called perishable, and you have to price them such that they will sell or they go unsold. Physical goods can get put on a shelf somewhere, and maybe we'll sell them for more later at some point in time, but services and this aspect of perishability makes it very important pricing them. Also, we have inseparability, which is inseparability in services means there's essentially high variable costs. So because it is a service being provided by a person collecting a salary, then we're not just cranking something off of a machine that we spent a lot of money on fixed costs, and now the unit cost of the service of a manufactured product is very low, but services tend to maintain a high percentage of variable costs as they're delivered, because they're human delivered typically. Also intangibility. So services are intangible, which means they're hard to objectively evaluate, which means they're hard to really decide how much they should be worth. And oftentimes people will use price quality heuristics in order to decide how much they should actually be valuing a service. So anytime we get into a situation where something is difficult for us to evaluate, we'll often rely on heuristics to decide how much this thing is worth. So we talked about a few heuristics back when we did some sort of low involvement ad processing. But one of the key ones in this space is price equals quality. So if I see something it's more expensive, I assume it must be better than something that's less expensive, even if I don't really have any knowledge or expertise to evaluate that thing. All right. So in services, we talk a lot about revenue management. So revenue management relates to perishability in particular, and making sure that something gets that seat on that airplane gets sold. So we know that, we take that basic service of the getting from point A to point B in the air in a certain amount of time, and we carve it up into as many different slices as we possibly can. So we know there's a certain percent of the population that will pay more for a sort of a more exclusive experience in that metal tube shooting across the sky. And so for them, we create this thing called first class, or maybe full class with no restrictions. And then we know that people who buy way in advance are very, need to have the date. And so we, are a little bit harsher with them. Then as it gets a little closer, we kind of figure out people maybe are a little bit more flexible, and we lower the price for them. And then as it gets inside of 2 weeks, we know those people are procrastinating and are really stuck, so we raise the price back up for them. And so and then maybe very last minute prices are people who are just bargain hunting, and we lower the price for them. So essentially, and within that we have economy plus, and we have all these other things. So some companies have made sort of a business model out of breaking apart different pieces of the air travel experience and selling them in different ways at different price points. And so this is the essence of kind of revenue management. We want to make sure that we're selling everything at the maximum amount of money we can get for that thing. And in many ways, it's related to skimming, which skimming often is the same idea, but we're usually skimming. It's the same exact product, but maybe just we sell it at innovators at a higher price and early adopters at a slightly lower price and laggards at an even lower price. That might fall under the heading of skimming. Also, we have product line pricing, where we create different brands of essentially the same experience, but we create different brands around that product or that job to be done in order to sell at different price points. But at the end of the day, all of these I've sort of said at some level, this is kind of what marketing is all about. It's sort of at a societal level, we're saying, okay, people need to have clean clothes for some job, and we're going to create 30 different ways for them to have clean clothes, each, sort of pointed at a slightly different persona who has a slightly different job to be done and a slightly different price sensitivity. And in that way, we can extract the maximum area under the demand curve. So if you look at this, what we're doing here is we are, if I just had one product, if I just had first class seats, so I had an airline that just sold, it was all first class seats. Not sure what that would, I think you kind of have to have non-first class in order to have first class, but that's beside the point. Let's just say we had that. Or let's just say full fare economy with no restrictions. Then if you look under that area under the demand curve, we would have this level of price and we have this level of quantity. And that would be the area under the demand curve that we would extract as a company. However, then if we also offer, this 3-week advanced purchase thing with $100 for changes, now we can charge a much lower price, but we can sell a lot of those. So now instead of just this section of the demand curve over here, we're also getting this other part. And so that's essentially what companies want to do, is they want to you're slicing the market in such a way that you're extracting these areas under each demand curve. And each little slice you're able to successfully create, you're capturing an additional piece of value. And this is kind of, this force drives market innovations. We have this downward sloping demand curve surrounding kind of a job to be done. And within that, we can carve out, or maybe a product type or product category would be a better way of thinking about it. And within that, we can carve out different jobs to be done within that in that sort of product or service category. So we might have a steak that I need to just celebrate my anniversary, and that's at one level, and a steak that I need to, because I need quick, kind of a festive night out, and then I may have a steak that I want to be Instagrammable, and all of these different, versions of that thing. When we create that, we are able to collect more area under the demand curve, and so that happens at a company level with something like Procter and Gamble. It happens at a single, an airline or an airplane, at a sort of a revenue management kind of space. It happens at a sort of a societal level in sort of capitalistic free market economies. Essentially, that's what's happening. So The way something like an airline on the same flight does it is with these things called rate fences. So fences are essentially the things that distinguish between the different price points. So we learned, or we spoke about a minute ago, that people don't like being charged the different amounts of money for the same from the same exact thing. So what marketers have to do is, think about where these fences exist, or manufacture fences, and say, okay, well, this now is going to be an airline seat with 3 inches more of legroom. Okay, this is going to be an airline seat that allows you to change without a penalty. This is going to be an airline seat where you get to get on the plane first and watch everybody come in after you. Like all these different, kind of different versions of this thing. This is an airline seat that you get to buy the day of. This is an airline seat you get to buy 3 months in advance. This is travel on a Wednesday. This is travel on a Friday. All these different things that are slightly different versions of each other. The dividing line between those are referred to as rate fences. And essentially, again, marketing, to a large extent, is sort of figuring out these fences and creating them. All right. So that's where we'll wrap up here with this lecture. On to move on to our final one on distribution and retailing.